The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace, as James Harrison adjusted his red uniform jacket for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold London air but from nerves that had been building for weeks. At 28 years old, James had been a palace guard for 5 years, but today felt different. Today he carried a secret that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. James walked through the ornate corridors, his polished black boots echoing against the ancient stones. Other guards nodded respectfully as he passed, unaware that their colleague was about to become the most talked-about person in Britain. The weight of what he knew pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. 3 weeks earlier, James had been assigned to the night shift in the east wing of the palace. It was supposed to be a quiet posting, watching over empty rooms and ensuring no one wandered where they shouldn't. The East Wing housed several private chambers, including those used by senior members of the royal family for private meetings and rest during long palace events. That particular night, James had been walking his usual route when he heard voices coming from the Queen Consort's private study. At first he thought nothing of it. Royal family members often worked late into the night, and Camilla was known for her dedication to her royal duties. But as he drew closer, something about the conversation made him pause. The voices were hushed, intimate in a way that made James uncomfortable. He knew he should walk away, continue his rounds, and forget whatever he might overhear. Palace guards were trained to be invisible, to see nothing and hear nothing that wasn't their business. But something in the tone of the conversation rooted him to the spot. Through the slightly open door, James could see Camilla sitting on a velvet sofa, but she wasn't alone. A man sat beside her, holding her hand in a way that was far too familiar for a business meeting. James couldn't see the man's face clearly from his position, but he could tell this wasn't King Charles. The figure was younger, taller, with dark hair that caught the lamplight. James felt his heart racing. He knew he was witnessing something he shouldn't, something that could destroy lives and bring scandal to the crown. His training told him to leave immediately, to pretend he had seen nothing. But his feet seemed frozen to the marble floor. The conversation continued, and James caught fragments of words that made his blood run cold. They spoke of meetings, of secret arrangements, of times when the king would be away on official duties. The intimacy between them was undeniable, and James realized he was watching something that could bring down the monarchy itself. Finally finding the strength to move, James backed away from the door and continued his rounds. But sleep didn't come easily that night or any night since. The image of what he had seen played over and over in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. Over the following weeks, James found himself paying closer attention to the comings and goings in the palace. He noticed things he had previously overlooked. The mysterious man he had seen that night was a regular visitor to the palace, someone who clearly had high-level access. James learned his name was Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a prominent art historian who served as an advisor to the royal collection. Dr. Whitmore was 45 years old, handsome in an intellectual way with graying temples that gave him a distinguished look. He had been working with the royal family for 3 years, cataloging and advising on their extensive art collection. His credentials were impeccable, his reputation spotless, and his access to the royal family nearly unlimited. James began to notice the subtle signs he had missed before. The way Camilla's face lit up when Dr. Whitmore arrived for meetings. How their official meetings seemed to run longer than scheduled. The private dinners that appeared on no official calendar. The way they looked at each other during public events thinking no one was watching. The knowledge ate at James like a cancer. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, but what did that mean when the threat came from within? Should he protect them from scandal by staying silent, or protect the institution of the monarchy by revealing the truth? James had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a nurse. They had raised him to believe in honor, duty, and doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. The royal family represented something sacred to his parents, a symbol of British values and tradition that had endured for centuries. Now, James found himself in possession of information that could destroy that symbol. He thought about his parents, about how devastated they would be to learn that their faith in the monarchy had been misplaced. He thought about the millions of people around the world who looked up to the royal family as an example of duty and moral leadership. But he also thought about King Charles, a man who had waited his entire life to become king, only to be betrayed by the woman he had married for love. Charles had endured decades of public scrutiny about his own past relationships, had fought to restore his reputation and gain acceptance as a future king. Now, in the twilight of his life, he faced the ultimate humiliation. As James walked through the palace corridors that morning, he made his decision. He couldn't continue to carry this secret alone. The weight of it was destroying him, making him question everything he believed about duty, honor, and loyalty. He had to act, but he needed to be smart about it. James had a friend who worked as a journalist for one of London's major newspapers. They had known each other since childhood, and James trusted him to handle the information responsibly. If the story was going to come out, and James believed it eventually would, it should be told by someone who would treat it with the gravity it deserved. The decision made, James felt a mixture of relief and terror. He was about to change the course of British history, to bring down a scandal that would make the events of the 1990s look like minor gossip. There would be no going back once he made that phone call. As he reached for his mobile phone, James took one last look around the palace that had been his life for 5 years. After today, nothing would ever be the same. The phone call that would change everything lasted exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds. James had timed it, watching the seconds tick by on his watch as he spoke in hushed tones to his childhood friend, Tom Bradley, now a senior reporter at the Daily Mirror. Tom's reaction had been exactly what James expected. Shocked silence followed by rapid-fire questions, followed by an urgent request to meet in person. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Hampstead, far from the prying eyes of palace security and Fleet Street gossip. James arrived first, choosing a corner table where he could watch the door. His hands shook as he stirred sugar into his coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic cup like a tiny bell tolling for the end of an era. Tom arrived 15 minutes later, looking every inch the seasoned journalist in his rumpled coat and wire-rimmed glasses. He had the hungry look of a reporter who sensed the story of a lifetime, but also the caution of a man who understood the magnitude of what James was offering. "You're absolutely certain about what you saw?" Tom asked after James had repeated his account in detail. "I've been a palace guard for 5 years," James replied. "I know the difference between a business meeting and whatever this was. The way they touched each other, the things they said when they thought no one was listening. This isn't just speculation, Tom, this is real." Tom pulled out a small recording device, then thought better of it and put it away. Some conversations were too dangerous to record. Instead, he took notes in his distinctive shorthand, a skill that had served him well in 20 years of journalism. "You understand what this means?" Tom said quietly. "This isn't just celebrity gossip. This is the Queen Consort, the wife of the King of England. If this comes out, it won't just be a scandal. It could bring down the government. It could end the monarchy as we know it." James nodded grimly. He had thought of little else for weeks. The British people had finally accepted Camilla after years of resentment over her role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. The royal family had worked tirelessly to rebuild their reputation after the disasters of the 1990s. All of that would be destroyed in an instant. "There's something else," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been watching more carefully since that night. This isn't a new relationship. I think it's been going on for months, maybe longer. Dr. Whitmore has been a regular visitor to the palace for 3 years. His access level is extraordinary for someone who's supposedly just an art advisor." Tom's pen moved rapidly across his notepad. He was already thinking like an investigative reporter, planning the research that would be needed to verify James's claims. Art historians didn't usually have unlimited access to royal family members. There had to be a paper trail, a pattern of meetings and visits that would support the story. "I'll need more than just your word," Tom said. "No offense, but this is too big to run on a single source. I'll need documentation, photographs, witnesses. Can you get me any of those?" James had been expecting this question. In the 3 weeks since witnessing that intimate scene, he had been carefully observing and, when possible, documenting. His phone contained several photos taken discreetly during Dr. Whitmore's visits to the palace. Nothing compromising, but enough to establish a pattern of frequent private meetings. "I have some photos," James said, sliding his phone across the table. "And I'm not the only one who's noticed. Other staff members have commented on how often Dr. Whitmore visits, how long his meetings run. There's a kitchen worker named Sarah who's mentioned seeing them together in private areas of the palace. Tom scrolled through the photos on James's phone, his expression growing more serious with each image. The photos showed Dr. Whitmore arriving at the palace at unusual hours, entering through private entrances typically reserved for family members. In one image, he could be seen leaving Camilla's private quarters at nearly midnight. "This is good," Tom said, "but I'll need more. I'll have to do background research on Dr. Whitmore, look into his credentials, his personal life, his financial situation. I'll need to verify his access levels and compare them to other royal advisors. And I'll need to find other sources who can corroborate what you've told me." The two men talked for another hour, planning the investigation that would follow. Tom explained the legal and ethical considerations involved in reporting on the royal family. The British press had strict guidelines about invasion of privacy, and the royal family's legal team was notoriously aggressive in protecting their clients. "If we do this," Tom said finally, "we have to do it right. One mistake, one unsubstantiated claim, and they'll destroy us in court. The story has to be bulletproof." James understood. His decision to come forward wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about potentially destroying his own life in the process. Palace guards who betrayed royal secrets didn't just lose their jobs. They became pariahs, unemployable, and forever marked as traitors. After leaving the cafe, James returned to the palace for his afternoon shift. Everything looked the same. The same grand hallways, the same priceless paintings, the same atmosphere of quiet dignity and ancient tradition. But James felt like he was walking through a house of cards that was about to collapse. His supervisor, Captain Morrison, called him into his office that afternoon. James's heart pounded as he knocked on the door, wondering if somehow his meeting with Tom had been discovered. "Harrison," Captain Morrison said, looking up from a stack of duty rosters, "I'm assigning you to the Queen Consort's detail for the rest of the week. Lady Pemberton is ill, and we need someone reliable to cover her duties." James felt his mouth go dry. Being assigned to Camilla's personal detail meant he would be in close proximity to her for hours each day. He would witness firsthand the interactions he had only glimpsed from a distance. "Is there a problem?" Captain Morrison asked, noticing James's hesitation. "No, sir," James replied quickly. "No problem at all, but there was a problem, a massive one." James was about to spend the next week watching the woman whose life he was planning to destroy. He would stand guard while she went about her royal duties, smile politely when she acknowledged him, and protect her with his life if necessary, all while knowing that he had already set in motion the events that would bring her world crashing down. That evening, James called Tom with the news of his new assignment. "This is perfect," Tom said, his excitement barely contained. "You'll have a front row seat to observe their interactions. Just be careful, James. Don't do anything that might raise suspicions. We need more time to build this story properly." James agreed, but privately he wondered how much time they actually had. Palace life was built on routine and observation. How long could Dr. Whitmore's frequent visits and extended private meetings go unnoticed by others? How long before someone else stumbled upon what James had discovered? As he lay in bed that night, James thought about the path that had led him to this moment. 5 years earlier, he had joined the palace guard because he believed in service, in protecting something larger than himself. Now he was about to betray that trust in service of what he believed was a greater truth. Tomorrow would begin his week as Camilla's personal guard. Tomorrow he would begin the most difficult role of his life: protector and destroyer, guardian and betrayer, all wrapped into one impossible position. The first day of James's assignment to Camilla's personal detail began at 6 a.m, with a briefing from Lady Pemberton's replacement coordinator. James learned that the Queen Consort had a packed schedule: a morning meeting with the Royal Horticultural Society, lunch with the governors of a children's charity, and an evening reception for Commonwealth ambassadors. What the official schedule didn't mention was Dr. Marcus Whitmore's appointment at 2 o'clock, listed simply as private consultation regarding the Gainsborough collection. James's stomach twisted as he read the notation, knowing that in just 8 hours, he would be witnessing another chapter in the affair that was slowly destroying his peace of mind. Camilla appeared at 7:30, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit and pearls. She moved through her morning routine with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades in the public eye. James noticed how she checked her appearance in every mirror they passed, adjusting her hair or smoothing her jacket with the automatic gestures of a woman who knew she was always being watched. "Good morning, Harrison," she said as they walked toward her first appointment. It was the first time she had ever addressed him directly, and James was struck by the warmth in her voice. This was the woman the British public had learned to love, gracious, down to earth, genuine in her interactions with staff and public alike. "Good morning, Your Majesty," James replied, falling into step behind her as they made their way to the palace's East Wing conference room. The morning meetings proceeded without incident. James stood at his assigned position by the door, alert but unobtrusive as Camilla discussed garden restoration projects and charity fundraising strategies. She was clearly knowledgeable about her causes, asking detailed questions and offering thoughtful suggestions. This was the side of royal life the public rarely saw, the hours of detailed work that went into supporting dozens of organizations and causes. During the lunch break, James found himself wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. The woman he was watching bore no resemblance to the scheming adulteress his imagination had created. She was professional, dedicated, and kind to everyone she encountered. When a young assistant spilled coffee on important documents, Camilla's response was to help clean up the mess while reassuring the mortified girl that accidents happen to everyone. But at exactly 2 o'clock, Dr. Marcus Whitmore arrived and everything changed. James watched from his position in the hallway as Dr. Whitmore was escorted to Camilla's private study. The change in her demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The professional mask slipped away, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. Her smile became radiant, her posture more relaxed. Even from a distance, James could see the transformation. The meeting was scheduled to last 30 minutes. James knew this because he had seen the appointment book. But 30 minutes became an hour, then 90 minutes. Other appointments were quietly rescheduled or canceled. Phone calls went unanswered. The palace staff began to exchange worried glances, but no one dared interrupt the Queen Consort's consultation. James positioned himself near the study door, ostensibly checking security protocols but actually straining to hear what was happening inside. The conversation was too muffled to make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable. There were long periods of silence broken by soft laughter. James heard the clink of teacups and the rustle of papers, but also sounds that made his cheeks burn with embarrassment. At one point, James thought he heard his name mentioned. His blood turned to ice as he realized they might be discussing palace security, perhaps even identifying him as a potential threat to their secret. He forced himself to remain calm, to continue his normal duties, but inside he was panicking. When Dr. Whitmore finally emerged from the study at 3:45, his hair was slightly disheveled and his tie askew. Camilla appeared in the doorway to see him off, and James witnessed something that would be burned into his memory forever. She reached up to straighten his tie, her fingers lingering on his chest longer than necessary. The gesture was intimate, possessive, and utterly damning. "Until next week," she said softly, her voice carrying just far enough for James to hear. "Until next week," Dr. Whitmore replied, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. James felt sick. There was no ambiguity now, no room for misinterpretation. What he was witnessing was a full-blown affair, complete with romantic gestures and planned future meetings. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and devastating. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Camilla attended her scheduled meetings, but she seemed distracted, glowing with a happiness that had nothing to do with charity work or diplomatic protocol. James noticed how she touched her hand, the one Dr. Whitmore had kissed throughout the evening, as if she could still feel his lips on her skin. That night, James called Tom from his small flat in South London. His hands were shaking as he dialed the number. "I saw them together," he said without preamble. "There's no doubt anymore, Tom. None at all." Tom listened as James described the day's events in detail. The journalist asked sharp, probing questions, building a timeline of the meeting and documenting every suspicious detail. "Did anyone else witness what you saw?" Tom asked. "Other staff members noticed the meeting ran long," James replied. The appointment secretary was visibly frustrated about the schedule changes. Security cameras would have recorded Dr. Whitmore's arrival and departure times. Tom was quiet for a moment, processing the information. "James, I need you to be very careful now. If they suspect you're watching them, if they think you know something, it could be dangerous for you." The warning sent a chill down James's spine. He hadn't considered that he might be putting himself in physical danger. But Tom was right. Scandals involving the royal family had a way of destroying anyone who got too close to them. Witnesses had a tendency to disappear from public view, their lives ruined by legal battles and media scrutiny. "I've been thinking about this all day," James said. "Maybe we should just drop it. Maybe some secrets are meant to stay secret." "It's too late for that," Tom replied gently. "I've already started the investigation. I've got researchers looking into Dr. Whitmore's background, his finances, his relationship history. If we stop now, eventually someone else will discover what you've discovered. At least this way we can control how the story comes out." James knew Tom was right, but that didn't make him feel any better. He was committed now, whether he liked it or not. The wheels were in motion and there was no way to stop them. The next morning brought more disturbing news. James arrived at work to find the palace buzzing with rumors. Apparently King Charles had made an unexpected decision to extend his state visit to Canada by 3 days. The change had been announced at the last minute, catching the palace staff completely off guard. James felt a chill of recognition. An extended royal tour meant more opportunities for private meetings, more time for Camilla and Dr. Whitmore to be together without the king's presence. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. As he took his position outside Camilla's office that morning, James realized that he was no longer just observing an affair. He was watching the systematic deception of the King of England. Every day that passed, every secret meeting, every lie by omission, made the eventual revelation more devastating. The betrayal was complete, and James was the only one who knew the truth. The weight of that knowledge was crushing him, but there was no turning back now. The story was bigger than any of them had imagined, and it was about to explode across the front pages of every newspaper in the world. 3 days into King Charles's extended Canadian tour, the palace felt different. There was a relaxed atmosphere among the staff, a sense that the most important eyes weren't watching. James noticed it immediately. Conversations lasted longer, protocols became more flexible, and security routines grew slightly less rigid. But nowhere was this change more obvious than in Camilla's behavior. The queen consort seemed transformed. Gone was the careful, measured woman who had spent decades perfecting her public image. In her place was someone younger, more vibrant, almost giddy with excitement. She hummed while walking through the corridors, smiled at nothing in particular, and checked her phone constantly for messages that made her face light up with joy. Dr. Whitmore's visits increased dramatically. What had been weekly appointments became daily consultations. The official reason was always the same. Urgent matters concerning the royal art collection required immediate attention. But James knew better. He had been carefully documenting every visit, every extended meeting, every suspicious detail. On the 4th day of the king's absence, James witnessed something that made his blood run cold. He was conducting his routine security check of the East Wing when he heard voices coming from the Queen's private sitting room. This was unusual. Camilla's schedule showed no appointments for that hour, and the room was supposed to be empty. James approached carefully, his training telling him to investigate any unauthorized presence in the royal quarters. What he saw through the partially open door would haunt him for the rest of his life. Camilla and Dr. Whitmore were in each other's arms, kissing with a passion that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. But it wasn't just the physical intimacy that shocked James. It was the words he overheard as they broke apart. "When will you tell him?" Dr. Whitmore asked, his hand still resting on Camilla's waist. "Soon," she replied, her voice breathless. "After the tour ends, after things settle down. Charles deserves to know the truth, but I need to find the right time, the right words." James felt his legs go weak. They weren't just having an affair. Camilla was planning to leave the king. The implications were staggering. A royal divorce would trigger a constitutional crisis. The Church of England, which the king headed, would be thrown into chaos. The monarchy itself might not survive such a scandal. "Are you certain?" Dr. Whitmore pressed. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Your life as you know it will be over." "My life as I know it ended the day I met you," Camilla replied, reaching up to touch his face. "I've spent my entire adult life being what other people needed me to be. For the first time, I want to be what I need to be." James backed away from the door, his mind reeling. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about the complete destruction of the royal family. When the public learned that Camilla was planning to abandon her royal duties for her lover, the backlash would be unprecedented. That evening, James met Tom at their usual cafe, but this time he could barely get the words out. The journalist listened with growing amazement as James described what he had witnessed. "She's going to leave him," Tom repeated, as if saying the words aloud might make them less unbelievable. "The Queen Consort is planning to abandon the King of England for an art historian." "It gets worse," James said, pulling out his phone. "I managed to get this." He showed Tom a photo he had taken using his phone's camera. It showed Dr. Whitmore leaving the palace at nearly midnight, using a private exit that was supposed to be reserved for emergency evacuations. The timestamp proved he had been in the palace for over 6 hours for what was officially listed as a 1-hour meeting. Tom studied the image carefully. "This is solid evidence of deception, but we need more. We need proof of the affair itself, not just suspicious meetings." "I've been thinking about that," James said. "There's a security camera in the corridor outside the Queen's sitting room. If their meeting was caught on tape, can you access the footage?" James hesitated. What Tom was asking would require him to abuse his security clearance in a way that would certainly end his career, and possibly land him in prison, but they had come too far to turn back now. "I can try," he said finally. "But if I get caught, don't get caught," Tom replied grimly. The next day, James volunteered for the night shift, claiming he wanted to earn overtime pay. His real goal was to access the security office when it would be minimally staffed. At 3 a.m, with only one other guard on duty, James made his move. The security system was sophisticated but not impossible to navigate for someone with James's access level. He located the footage from the previous afternoon and began to review it carefully. What he found exceeded his worst fears. The camera had indeed captured Camilla and Dr. Whitmore entering the sitting room together. More damaging still, it showed them in clearly intimate poses through the room's glass door panel. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. Here was visual proof of the affair that would soon destroy the British monarchy. James copied the footage to an encrypted drive, his hands shaking with the magnitude of what he was doing. He was stealing evidence that would bring down the crown, betraying an oath he had sworn to protect the royal family with his life. But he was also exposing a betrayal that went to the very heart of the institution he had pledged to serve. As he prepared to leave the security office, James heard footsteps in the corridor. His heart stopped as he realized someone was approaching. If he was caught with the stolen footage, his life would be over. There would be no explaining away what he had done. The footsteps paused outside the door. James held his breath, praying that whoever it was would continue walking. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, fading away down the corridor. James waited another 10 minutes before carefully leaving the office and returning to his regular duties. The next morning, Tom called with urgent news. His research into Dr. Whitmore's background had uncovered something explosive. "He's broke," Tom said without preamble. "Dr. Whitmore is deeply in debt. His art consulting business is failing. His house is mortgaged to the hilt and he owes money to some very unpleasant people." James felt a chill of understanding. "You think he's using Camilla?" "I think he's using her for money, access, and possibly as an escape route from his financial problems. If she leaves Charles for him, she'll likely receive a substantial divorce settlement. Even if she doesn't, her royal connections could open doors for his business that would solve all his money troubles." This revelation changed everything. What James had assumed was a tragic love story was actually something much more sinister. A calculated seduction designed to exploit a lonely woman's emotional vulnerability for financial gain. Camilla wasn't just betraying her husband. She was being manipulated by a man who saw her as nothing more than a path to wealth and status. "We have to tell her," James said. "She has a right to know what kind of man she's involved with." "That's not our job," Tom replied firmly. "Our job is to report the truth. What people do with that truth is up to them." But James couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to destroy an innocent woman along with a guilty one. Camilla might be committing adultery, but she was also being victimized by someone who had deliberately targeted her weaknesses. The story was becoming more complex and more tragic with every revelation. As he prepared for another day of watching the Queen Consort live out her romantic fantasy with a man who was systematically deceiving her, James realized that the palace guard who had crashed into this situation was no longer him. He had become something else entirely. He was now the keeper of secrets that would reshape British history, a reluctant witness to the fall of everything he had once believed in. The crash was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The morning King Charles was scheduled to return from Canada donned gray and drizzly, matching James's mood as he took his position outside Camilla's quarters. He had spent the previous night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the knowledge that in just a few hours, he would watch a woman unknowingly prepare for the destruction of her entire world. Camilla appeared at 8 o'clock, and James was shocked by her appearance. Gone was the glowing, happy woman of the past week. She looked pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes that even expert makeup couldn't completely hide. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her jewelry, and she checked her phone obsessively, though no messages seemed to bring her comfort. "Harrison," she said as they began their morning walk to her first appointment. "You've been with the palace guard for several years, haven't you?" "5 years, Your Majesty," James replied, startled by the unexpected conversation. "Do you ever wonder if duty and happiness can coexist?" she asked, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "Or if sometimes we must choose between what we owe others and what we owe ourselves?" James felt his throat constrict. Here was the woman he was about to destroy, asking him questions that cut to the heart of his own moral crisis. "I think duty means different things to different people, Your Majesty. Sometimes the greatest duty is to truth, even when it's painful." Camilla looked at him sharply, as if hearing something unexpected in his words. "Truth," she repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose that's what it all comes down to in the end, doesn't it?" The morning passed in a blur of official engagements that Camilla performed with mechanical precision. She smiled at the right moments, said the appropriate words, and fulfilled her ceremonial obligations, but James could see that her mind was elsewhere. She was preparing for something, gathering courage for a conversation that would change everything. At 11:30, Dr. Whitmore arrived for what the schedule listed as a final consultation on the Gainsborough authentication. James knew this would be their last private meeting before the King's return, possibly their last opportunity to finalize whatever plan they had been developing. As James watched Dr. Whitmore disappear into Camilla's study, his phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Story goes to print tomorrow morning. Are you ready for this?" James stared at the message, his finger hovering over the reply button. Tomorrow morning, the entire world would wake up to headlines that would end the monarchy as they knew it. By evening, Camilla's name would be spoken with the same disgust once reserved for the most notorious royal scandals in history. But something in her demeanor that morning had shaken him. The woman he had observed over the past week wasn't the calculating adulteress he had expected to find. She was lost, conflicted, clearly suffering over the choices she was making. Yes, she was betraying her husband, but she was also being manipulated by a man whose motives were purely selfish. James made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of texting Tom back, he moved closer to the study door, positioning himself where he could hear the conversation inside. If he was going to destroy this woman's life, he needed to understand exactly what kind of person she really was. What he heard changed everything. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," Camilla was saying, her voice thick with tears. "I thought I could. But seeing Charles's messages from Canada, hearing how excited he is to come home, I can't destroy him like this." "You're just nervous," Dr. Whitmore replied, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been in previous conversations. "It's natural to have doubts before making such a big change." "It's not doubts," Camilla said firmly. "It's clarity. I love you, but I can't build my happiness on the ruins of someone else's life. Charles has waited his entire life to be king. I won't be the person who makes his reign a joke." James heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, and Dr. Whitmore's voice grew harder. "So that's it? You're just going to throw away everything we've planned? Everything I've sacrificed for you?" "Sacrificed?" Camilla's voice rose slightly. "What exactly have you sacrificed, Marcus? You've lost nothing. You've risked nothing. I'm the one who's been living a lie, betraying someone who trusts me completely. Don't be naive, Camilla. Do you think Charles has been faithful to you during your marriage? Do you think any of these people really care about you? Or are you just another trophy to them?" The cruelty in Dr. Whitmore's voice was shocking. Gone was the charming, sophisticated man who had swept Camilla off her feet. In his place was someone cold and calculating, a man whose true nature was finally being revealed. "Get out," Camilla said quietly. "What?" "I said get out. This is over, Marcus, all of it. Don't contact me again. Don't try to see me. Don't even think about using what's happened between us as leverage for anything. If you do, I'll make sure you never work in art authentication again." James heard footsteps moving rapidly toward the door and quickly stepped back, pretending to check his radio. Dr. Whitmore burst out of the study, his face flushed with anger and what looked like panic. He walked quickly past James without acknowledgement, his earlier composure completely shattered. A moment later, Camilla appeared in the doorway. Her makeup was smudged, her composure broken, but there was something different about her expression. For the first time since James had been watching her, she looked like herself again, not the lovesick woman who had been meeting secretly with Dr. Whitmore, but the strong, dignified person who had earned the respect of the British people. "Harrison," she said, her voice steadier than James expected, "I believe my schedule has just cleared up considerably. Please inform my secretary that I'll be spending the afternoon preparing for the king's return." "Yes, Your Majesty," James replied, struggling to keep his voice neutral. As Camilla disappeared back into her study, James felt his world spinning. Everything had changed in the space of 10 minutes. The affair was over, ended by Camilla herself before it could destroy everything she held dear. The woman he had been prepared to expose as a scheming adulteress had just revealed herself to be someone wrestling with genuine moral conflict, someone who ultimately chose duty over desire. But the story was already in motion. Tom's investigation was complete, the evidence had been gathered, and the presses were preparing to roll. In less than 24 hours, the world would learn about an affair that no longer existed, would judge a woman for choices she had ultimately rejected. James pulled out his phone and typed frantically, "Emergency. Need to meet immediately." "Everything has changed." Tom's reply came back instantly. "Too late. Story is locked. Presses start rolling at midnight." James felt panic rising in his throat. He had set in motion the destruction of an innocent woman, not innocent of adultery, but innocent of the calculating betrayal the story would portray. Camilla had ended the affair herself, had chosen her duty to the crown over her personal happiness. She deserved condemnation for her infidelity, but not for a betrayal she had ultimately refused to commit. As the afternoon wore on, James watched Camilla prepare for her husband's return with the same meticulous attention she brought to all her royal duties. She reviewed his schedule, arranged his favorite flowers in their private quarters, and personally selected the wine for their dinner together. Every action spoke of a woman trying to rebuild a marriage she had almost destroyed. At 6 o'clock, King Charles returned to the palace. James watched from his position as Camilla greeted her husband with what appeared to be genuine warmth and relief. The king was clearly delighted to see her, his face lighting up as he kissed her cheek and took her hand. "My dear," James heard him say, "you look wonderful. I've missed you terribly." "I've missed you too," Camilla replied, and for the first time in weeks, James believed she was telling the complete truth. As the royal couple disappeared into their private quarters to share dinner and catch up on the week's events, James realized that he was watching the end of a story, not the beginning. The scandal was over before it could truly begin, ended by a woman's conscience rather than exposure by the press. But tomorrow morning, none of that would matter. The newspapers would scream about royal betrayal and adultery. The public would demand answers, and Camilla's reputation would be destroyed by a love affair she had already sacrificed for duty. James had become the palace guard who crashed into everything, but he was no longer sure whether he was a protector or a destroyer. In trying to serve the truth, he might have created the greatest lie of all. The clock in James's small flat showed 11:47 p.m. when he finally gave up trying to sleep and reached for his phone. In 13 minutes, the first copies of tomorrow's Daily Mirror would roll off the presses, carrying a story that would destroy everything the royal family had worked to rebuild over the past decade. The headline would scream across newsstands from London to Edinburgh: "Queen Consort's secret affair exposed. Palace guard reveals all." James had spent the evening frantically calling Tom, begging him to stop the story, explaining what he had witnessed that afternoon. But the machinery of journalism, once set in motion, was almost impossible to stop. The story had been fact-checked, legal reviewed, and formatted for print. Stopping it now would cost the newspaper hundreds of thousands of pounds and potentially allow competitors to break the story first. "I understand your concerns," Tom had said during their final conversation, "but the affair happened, James, even if it's over now. The public has a right to know that their queen consort was unfaithful to the king. That doesn't change because she had a crisis of conscience. But it did change things, at least in James's mind. The difference between a woman who betrayed her husband and one who almost betrayed her husband but chose duty instead was enormous. The story would paint Camilla as a calculating adulteress who had to be exposed to end her affair, when the truth was that she had ended it herself, choosing love of country over love of a man who had been using her all along. At 12:01 a.m., James's phone buzzed with a news alert. The story was live on the Mirror's website. Within minutes, it would be picked up by news services around the world. By morning, every major newspaper, television station, and social media platform would be discussing the downfall of Queen Consort Camilla. James forced himself to read the article, though every word felt like a knife to his conscience. Tom had written it skillfully, presenting the facts without sensationalism, but the impact was devastating nonetheless. The photos James had provided were prominently displayed. Dr. Whitmore entering and leaving the palace at unusual hours. The security footage showing intimate moments between him and Camilla. The documentation of extended private meetings that had no legitimate purpose. The article revealed Dr. Whitmore's financial troubles, painting him as a fortune hunter who had targeted the queen consort for her wealth and connections. It detailed the timeline of their affair, from the first suspicious meetings to the passionate encounters James had witnessed. Most damaging of all, it quoted their conversation about Camilla's plans to leave the king, presenting it as an ongoing conspiracy, rather than a plan she had already abandoned. The story was factually accurate but incomplete. It captured the scandal perfectly while missing the redemption entirely. James's phone rang at 2:17 a.m. The caller ID showed his parents' number in Manchester. "James, love." His mother's voice was thick with worry and confusion. "We just saw the news online. They're saying you're the source for this terrible story about the Queen. Please tell me it's not true." James closed his eyes, unable to lie to the woman who had raised him. "It's true, Mom." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, his father's voice came on the line, cold and disappointed in a way that cut deeper than any anger could have. "How could you do this, son? We raised you better than this. The royal family represents everything decent about this country, and you've destroyed it for what? Money, fame? I don't understand." "Dad, it's not that simple," James began, but his father cut him off. "Don't you dare try to justify this betrayal. You took an oath to protect them, and instead you've stabbed them in the back. Your mother and I are ashamed of what you've become." The line went dead. James stared at his phone, realizing that his parents' reaction would be multiplied millions of times across Britain. To the public, he wouldn't be a whistleblower exposing corruption. He would be a traitor who had sold his honor for 30 pieces of silver. By morning, the story had exploded beyond anything James had imagined. It was the lead story on every news program, the top trending topic on social media, and the subject of emergency sessions in Parliament. The reaction was swift and brutal. Public opinion turned against Camilla with a viciousness that surprised even hardened political observers. The woman who had slowly won acceptance over 2 decades was instantly transformed back into the most hated person in Britain. Protesters gathered outside Buckingham Palace carrying signs calling for her exile. Social media filled with demands for her immediate removal from all royal duties. But the most heartbreaking reaction came from King Charles himself. At noon, the palace released a brief statement. His Majesty is deeply hurt by recent revelations and asks for privacy during this difficult time. The statement was signed not by Charles, but by his private secretary, suggesting that the king was too devastated to even approve official communications. James watched the coverage from his flat, unable to leave for fear of being recognized by reporters who were already hunting for the palace insider who had broken the story. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deal offers, and threats from angry royalists who had somehow obtained his number. At 3 o'clock that afternoon,
James received a call that changed everything.
The voice was cultured, professional, and utterly cold. "Mr. Harrison, this is Sir Michael Davidson, the King's private secretary. His Majesty would like to see you immediately. James felt his blood turn to ice. A summons to meet the king could only mean one thing. His role in the scandal had been discovered. There would be consequences beyond the loss of his job, beyond the destruction of his reputation. The Crown had ways of dealing with betrayers that didn't involve courts or public proceedings. "I'll be there in an hour," James managed to say. The drive to Buckingham Palace felt like a journey to his own execution. James used his security pass one last time, knowing it would be confiscated before he left the building. The corridors that had been his workplace for 5 years now felt alien and hostile, every portrait seeming to glare at him with royal disapproval. Sir Michael met him at the entrance to the king's private study. The older man's expression was a mixture of disgust and pity. "His Majesty will see you now," he said, opening the heavy oak door. King Charles stood with his back to the room, staring out a window that overlooked the palace gardens. He looked older than his years, his shoulders slumped with the weight of personal and public humiliation. When he finally turned around, James was shocked by the pain in his eyes. "Sit down, Mr. Harrison," the king said quietly. His voice carried none of the authority James expected, only profound sadness. James took the offered chair, his hands shaking as he waited for the royal wrath to fall upon him. "I know it was you," Charles said simply. "Security cameras showed you accessing the footage, and your friend Mr. Bradley has already confirmed your cooperation with his investigation. I'm not here to punish you, Mr. Harrison. I'm here to understand why." The question hung in the air like a challenge. James had prepared for anger, for threats, for legal consequences. He hadn't prepared for this, a broken man asking for an explanation that might help him make sense of his personal catastrophe. "Your Majesty," James began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I thought I was protecting the crown. I thought exposing the truth was my duty." "And was it?" Charles asked. "Was destroying my marriage and humiliating the monarchy really your duty, Mr. Harrison?" James felt tears welling up in his eyes. "No, sir. I realize now that it wasn't. I've made a terrible mistake, and I don't know how to fix it." King Charles studied him for a long moment, then did something that surprised James more than anything else that had happened in the past 24 hours. He sat down in the chair across from him, not as a king addressing a subject, but as one man talking to another. "The truth is, Mr. Harrison, that you've probably saved my marriage," Charles said quietly. "My wife came to me this morning and told me everything about the affair, about ending it before your story broke, about her determination to be the partner I deserve. If your investigation hadn't forced this crisis, I might have spent years wondering why she seemed distant, why she was unhappy. Now we have a chance to rebuild our relationship on honesty rather than secrets." James stared at the king in amazement. "You're not angry?" "Oh, I'm furious," Charles replied with a bitter smile. "But not at you. I'm angry at the man who manipulated my wife's loneliness for his own gain. I'm angry at myself for not noticing that she was struggling. I'm angry at the situation that made her feel she had to look elsewhere for affection. But you were just doing what you thought was right." The king stood up, signaling that the interview was over. "You'll be dismissed from the palace guard, of course. Your security clearance will be revoked, and you'll likely face legal challenges from Dr. Whitmore's lawyers. But you won't face prosecution from the crown. Consider that my final gift to a man who thought he was serving his country." As James walked out of Buckingham Palace for the last time, he realized that the palace guard who had crashed into the royal chambers and exposed their secrets had ultimately revealed something more important than scandal. He had revealed the capacity for forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility that even the greatest betrayals could sometimes lead to greater truth. The story would continue.